Elderly woman in worn Sunday dress humiliated in first class. Reveals shocking truth that leaves everyone speechless. Ma'am, this is the first class section. Please return to your seat in economy. The voice of the young flight attendant was clear but cold as it echoed through the first class cabin. Her eyes quickly scanned the elderly woman standing before her, stopping at the worn Sunday dress that had clearly aged over time. The simplicity of the outfit seemed out of place in the lavish surroundings. The woman, appearing to be in her 70s, was petite with a gentle face that radiated an unusual calmness. She did not respond, simply handing over the ticket she held. Her silence seemed to irritate the flight attendant further. "Do you understand what I'm saying? This isn't a seat meant for someone like you." The attendant emphasized her words, raising her voice to draw the attention of the other passengers. Eyes began to turn towards the elderly woman, some filled with curiosity, others with disdain, and some just eager for a bit of entertainment during the long flight. A few snickers drifted from nearby seats. The elderly woman stood firm. Her frail hands clung tightly to the ticket, as if fearing it might be taken from her at any moment. Yet her deep-set eyes stayed fixed on the flight attendant, unwavering. "Look at that dress you're wearing," the flight attendant continued, this time with a tone dripping with mockery. "A dress that's shabby, probably bought from a thrift store, I suppose? I doubt it's even worth as much as a meal served in this cabin." The elderly woman blinked softly, as if the words could not harm her. But her hands, gripping the ticket, trembled slightly, her knuckles turning white from the force. "I'm sorry," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible. "I am simply following instructions. This is my assigned seat." The attendant squinted, a sardonic smile playing on her lips. "If you continue to insist on sitting here, I will have to call the captain. Believe me, the outcome won't be pleasant." Laughter erupted around them. Some passengers even took out their phones to record the scene. Still, the elderly woman remained unmoved. Her eyes now held a strange glimmer, patience mingled with an unspoken inner strength. "Fine then." The attendant spoke curtly, flashing a challenging smile. "We'll let the captain decide. I'll prove to everyone who is truly in the wrong." She turned on her heel, unaware that each step was bringing her closer to a storm she could never have anticipated. She walked briskly towards the back of the cabin to use the intercom phone. Her face carried an expression of smugness mixed with disdain, convinced she was doing the right thing, defending the prestige of first class, which she believed was only for those who deserved it. "What a nuisance," she muttered while dialing. "Someone in an old Sunday dress like that. How could she possibly belong here? Must have bought an economy ticket and sneaked up." Meanwhile, the tension in the cabin grew thicker. Some passengers were visibly annoyed, not out of sympathy for the woman, but due to the interruption of their sleep or work. A man in an expensive suit nearby sighed impatiently. "Why can't they resolve this quickly? Such a waste of time." A well-dressed woman sitting across the aisle glanced at the elderly lady and whispered to her companion, "The attendant's right. Look at that dress. She's an eyesore in first class." The elderly woman remained silent in her seat. The worn Sunday dress, with frayed stitching, hung on her small frame. But despite the weariness in her eyes, they still held an extraordinary tranquility, as if she was accustomed to these judgmental stares. Just a few minutes later, the door between the first-class cabin and the cockpit opened. The captain stepped in, a tall, middle-aged man in a crisp uniform. His eyes were stern as they scanned the cabin before settling on the elderly woman. "What seems to be the problem here?" His voice was deep and authoritative. The flight attendant hurried over, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Captain, this woman does not have a first-class ticket, but insists on sitting here. I asked her to return to her assigned seat, but she refuses to cooperate." The captain frowned, moving closer to the elderly woman. He stood straight before her, looking down at her with a stern gaze. "Do you have a ticket for this seat, ma'am?" the captain asked, his voice deep but firm. The elderly woman didn't reply immediately. She slowly opened her old handbag and took out a crumpled plane ticket. Her hands were trembling slightly as she handed it to the captain, but her gaze remained calm. The captain took the ticket, quickly verifying the information, But as his eyes landed on the class designation, his brows furrowed. His expression shifted from surprise to confusion and then to fear. A deadly silence enveloped the first-class cabin. The young flight attendant stood beside him, trying to peek over the captain's shoulder. She couldn't understand why his expression had changed so drastically. "Captain, is there something wrong?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Without answering, the captain turned back towards the elderly woman. His once stern eyes were now filled with regret and alarm. He bowed his head low, almost stammering as he spoke. Ma'am, you are the founder of Liberty Airlines." Those words echoed like thunder throughout the first-class cabin. Several passengers gaped, and a few immediately stopped recording on their phones. The air grew thick, almost stifling with tension. "The founder?" The flight attendant repeated, her voice trembling. She looked over at the elderly woman, who was still sitting quietly, though her eyes no longer held the gentle look from before. Now they were sharp, cold, and commanding. "Ma'am," the captain continued, his voice filled with urgency, "I truly did not know you were on this flight. Please forgive us for our disrespect." The flight attendant stood frozen in place. She began to realize her mistake, but had no idea how to salvage the situation. She stammered, I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." The elderly woman spoke gently, but her voice carried across the cabin like a pronouncement. "If I weren't the founder, do you think it would have been acceptable for you to treat me like that?" The entire first-class cabin fell into silence. The passengers who had laughed now hung their heads, avoiding her gaze. But she paid them no attention. Her eyes were fixed firmly on the flight attendant, waiting for a response. Emily, the attendant, had nothing left to say. Her legs trembled as if they could no longer support her, and she realized the full weight of her disdainful words and actions, leaving a stain she could never easily erase. The atmosphere in the cabin was unbearably heavy, as if the air itself had been sucked out. Stunned, embarrassed glances shifted between the captain, the flight attendant, and the elderly woman. The elderly woman remained composed, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes straight ahead without a hint of panic. Her calm demeanor cut through the air like a sharp blade. The captain, once the most powerful figure on the plane, now stood with his head bowed before her. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize. This is entirely our fault, and I take full responsibility." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slowly stood up, her worn but neatly pressed Sunday dress clinging to her small frame. But each step she took seemed to reverberate through the cabin. "What is your name?" She turned towards the flight attendant. Her voice was gentle, but sharp as a blade. The flight attendant flinched, not daring to raise her head. My name is Emily," she replied, her voice trembling, each word coming out with difficulty. "Emily," the elderly woman repeated, as if engraving the name into the air. "Emily, what gives you the right to humiliate me, or any other passenger for that matter?" I didn't know who you were." Emily tried to defend herself, but her voice grew weaker with each word, as if she knew herself that the excuse wasn't enough. "You didn't know who I was, and that gives you an excuse to look down on me? If I were just an ordinary person, do you think what you did would have been acceptable?" The woman's voice was sharp, each word like a hammer blow to Emily's conscience. The other passengers began to grow uneasy. Some who had earlier laughed or recorded videos of Emily insulting the elderly woman now hung their heads, their faces flushed with shame. One man, who initially seemed annoyed by the woman's presence, spoke up, his voice hesitant. I apologize for not intervening sooner. I honestly had no idea who you were." The elderly woman turned to look at him, her eyes softening slightly. "It does not matter that you didn't know who I am, but you should know that everyone, whether they are wearing an old Sunday dress or dressed in luxury, deserves the same respect." The man lowered his head, saying nothing more. The woman turned back to Emily. "How long have you been a flight attendant?" Almost 3 years, ma'am," Emily stammered. 3 years, the woman repeated, her voice contemplative. "And in those 3 years, how many people like me have you insulted? How many people have endured your disdain simply because they didn't fit the image you believed was worthy?" Emily had no answer, tears beginning to run down her face. "I'm sorry," she blurted out, her voice choked with emotion. "I didn't mean to. I didn't think." "You didn't think this was wrong? Or you just didn't think that I might be someone who could make you regret it?" The elderly woman cut her off, her voice not loud, but filled with authority, making Emily unable to meet her eyes. The captain stepped in, trying to ease the tension. "Ma'am, we will address this matter immediately. Flight attendant Emily will be suspended as soon as we land. We promise to issue the appropriate disciplinary action." The elderly woman raised her hand, signaling for him to be silent. "This isn't just about me, it's about your entire approach. What needs to change is not only how you handle things, but the entire mindset of Liberty Airlines staff." She looked around the cabin, her gaze moving not only over Emily, but also over the passengers who had laughed or remained silent. We live in a society where people find it too easy to judge others based solely on appearances. But today, I want to remind everyone of one thing. Respect is not the privilege of the wealthy, the beautiful, or the successful. Respect is a basic right for every human being. The first-class cabin fell into silence again, no one daring to utter a word. Her words were like a mirror held up to each person's soul, exposing their selfishness and superficiality. The elderly woman walked back to her seat, her hands gently smoothing the old Sunday dress that had grown tired with time. Yet her eyes remained bright, sharp like a quietly burning flame, strong enough to awaken even the stillness around her. Emily stood frozen in place. She knew that this storm was far from over. It was only the beginning of an inevitable change. The captain quickly returned to the cockpit to resume his duties, but before leaving, he bowed deeply towards the elderly woman. He said nothing, but his gesture conveyed both apology and respect. Emily remained standing there, her legs trembling, her eyes filled with tears. She silently watched the small figure of the elderly woman, understanding that the true strength of this woman did not come from her appearance, but from her composure and sharp words. The surrounding passengers slowly returned to their seats, but the air in the cabin remained thick with tension. Some passengers stole glances at the elderly woman, their eyes no longer mocking, but instead filled with respect mixed with embarrassment. "Ma'am," Emily stammered, her voice so faint that the elderly woman did not hear. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure, and took a step closer to the elderly woman. "Ma'am, I truly apologize. I didn't know who you were and I had no intention of hurting you." The elderly woman slowly looked up at her. "Are you apologizing because you didn't know who I was, or because your actions were wrong?" The question left Emily speechless. She didn't know how to respond. The words of justification seemed stuck in her throat, and she could only stand there, her head bowed in silence. "Do you know what hurt me the most?" The elderly woman continued, her voice soft and calm. "Not the words you said, but the fact that you truly believed you had the right to say them, simply because I was wearing an old Sunday dress." The nearby passengers listened intently, though they tried to appear as if they were looking elsewhere. A young woman seated nearby suddenly stood up, her voice trembling slightly but sincere. "Ma'am, I also want to apologize. Earlier, I laughed. I thought it was amusing, but now I realize I was wrong. I shouldn't have stayed silent, and I shouldn't have laughed." The elderly woman turned, her gaze softening slightly. She nodded gently. "Thank you. Admitting a mistake is the first step towards correcting it." Those words spread like a wildfire, and gradually, more passengers stood up to apologize for their indifference, their silence, or even the laughter from earlier. Flight attendant Emily began to cry, but this time, it wasn't out of fear or anxiety. It was genuine regret. She bowed deeply, nearly collapsing to her knees. "Ma'am, I know I was wrong. I will accept any punishment, but please believe me. I had no intention of hurting anyone. I only wanted to do my job well, but clearly, I failed." The elderly woman looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes no longer held anger, only contemplation. Finally, she spoke. "Mistakes do not define who you are, Emily, but how you correct them will." The cabin gradually returned to a state of calm, the heavy tension slowly dissipating. In its place was a quiet but profound awakening. Everyone, whether rich or poor, powerful or ordinary, realized one thing. Respect is not a luxury, it is a fundamental value. The flight continued, but that story was far from over. Emily quietly returned to her workstation, unable to lift her head to meet the eyes of the passengers. From that day on, she knew she had to change, not just for her job, but for herself. The elderly woman returned to her seat, placing her hands gently on her worn Sunday dress. Despite the disdainful stares and harsh words it had endured, that dress was still her greatest pride. Outside, the sky was endless blue, and the plane glided smoothly above the clouds, carrying not only people, but also the deep lessons that would be remembered forever. As the plane landed, the setting sun faded beyond the horizon. Passengers disembarked one by one, but the atmosphere in first class remained filled with unease and embarrassment. No one seemed eager to make eye contact with the elderly woman, the one they had either unwittingly or openly disrespected. Emily stood quietly by the aisle, avoiding everyone's gaze. The tears had dried on her cheeks, but within her was a storm of emotions. She felt small and insignificant in the presence of the woman she had once looked down upon, simply because of her modest appearance. Emily. The captain's voice startled her. He approached, his expression still stern, though his eyes held a softer light. You should prepare yourself. Management will review your case after I report it. But before that happens, I hope, you reflect deeply on everything that occurred today. Emily bowed her head, nodding slightly without saying a word. The captain turned to the elderly woman, bending deeply in yet another gesture of apology. The woman said nothing, only nodded slightly before leaving the plane, her steps slow yet steady. The city was bathed in the gentle light of a spring morning, sunlight softly reflecting off the glass windows of Liberty Airlines headquarters. Inside the spacious office, Grace Hamilton, the elderly woman, sat at her desk. On the desk stood a framed photograph, within which lay her old Sunday dress, a symbol of the hardships she endured to build Liberty Airlines from nothing. Ma'am, there's someone waiting outside. She says you invited her here today. The secretary's voice came from the door. Send her in. The door opened, and Emily stepped inside. She was no longer in her polished flight attendant uniform. Instead, she wore simple attire. Her eyes, when they met Mrs. Grace's, were filled with respect, mixed with a hint of anxiety. Good morning, ma'am, Emily said softly, bowing her head. Mrs. Grace nodded, gesturing towards the chair in front of her. Have a seat. She spoke, her gaze still gentle, but no less stern. I received your letter. I want to hear from you. What have you learned from that day? Emily sat up straight, taking a deep breath. Ma'am, that day was a turning point in my life. At first, I thought the punishment you gave me was unfair, but after reflecting, I realized that it was I who had been unfair to so many others. She paused, her eyes briefly clouded with sadness. I have since taken courses in psychology and customer service. I also spent a lot of time meeting people who have been undervalued by society simply because of their appearance. I learned that every person deserves respect, not because of who they are, but simply because they are human. Mrs. Grace remained silent for a long while, then finally nodded. Good. You've understood the most important lesson. Ma'am, Emily said, her eyes filled with determination. I am not asking for forgiveness. I just want the opportunity to prove that I have changed. Mrs. Grace looked at her, a gentle smile forming on her face. You don't need to ask for an opportunity. It has always been in your hands. What matters is whether or not you are willing to seize it. Emily began participating in the internal training program at Liberty Airlines, becoming an inspiration for the new team of employees. Her stories of arrogance and the lessons she learned about humility gradually spread, motivating others to change their perspective on customers and colleagues. Meanwhile, Mrs. Grace continued to lead Liberty Airlines with a clearer vision than ever before. Respect is the foundation of service. That day, as Emily left Mrs. Grace's office, she paused in front of the building, looking up at the clear blue sky. She smiled, realizing that her life had truly changed. And from that moment, she walked on a new path, the path of respect and empathy. The story may have ended, but the lessons from that fateful flight still echo, resonating in all of our hearts. Prejudice isn't easy to overcome, but change can start with small actions. What about you? Have you ever witnessed or experienced such prejudice? Share your story in the comments below. Perhaps your story could be the spark that inspires change and helps shift someone's perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss more meaningful stories. See you in the next video.